And we see. All right, so good morning, everybody. And I hope you're all well. And those who joined us today are all well. Uh, Today, as you know, it's the last class of the year. And as discussed, we'll be addressing, this is a bonus class, Mill called it a bonus class. We'll be addressing a number of specific global issues that the new administration will have to tackle starting January 20th, 21st. I realize that most of you must be suffering by now of a serious case of election fatigue, made more acute by the confinement that prevents you from turning your attention to other issues, lighter issues. And I cannot blame you, obviously. So even though there is still no official winner, uh, some 3 weeks, it will be 3 weeks tomorrow, after the election. Let's say we'll just pretend today that there is one, so that we can make some reasonable and realistic predictions about what can be expected from a Biden administration foreign policy in the years to come. Let me start with two general observations I already made actually in previous classes. The first one is that I do not expect personally the new administration to prioritize foreign policy at the beginning anyway, unless a serious international crisis forces it to do so. Biden himself said many times that containing the COVID-19 would be his administration's number one priority, with as its corollary, the revival of the economy. The second observation is that much will depend on the outcome, and that I mentioned also in our previous classes, the outcome of the elections for the two senatorial seats in Georgia next January 5. If both seats are won by the Democrats, they will get to 50 seats and tie the Republicans who hold already the other 50 seats out of the 100-seat Senate. In that case, on issues where the Senate votes along party lines, and it is most likely that it will do so, particularly at this time of bitter polarization, Vice President Harris would cast the tie-breaking vote, tipping the scale in favor of the Democrats and enabling thus the administration to implement its policy unimpeded, including its foreign policies. If, on the contrary, the Republicans win only one of the two available seats in play and hold on to the Senate, they'll be able to slow down, amend, or strike down many of the administration's policies, foreign or domestic, thus exercising a greater deal of control over the American foreign policy, at least until the next midterm elections in 2022. In the meantime, let's see what type of global landscape does a Biden administration inherit. In essence, it's a landscape of challenges. The US-China relations are the worst since the countries normalized ties like something like 4 decades ago. America's allies in Europe are alienated. The most important nuclear anti-proliferation treaty is about to expire with Russia. Iran is amassing enriched nuclear fuel again. And North Korea is unveiling its atomic arsenal, nuclear arsenal. not to mention global warming, refugee crisis, and the persistent threat of the COVID-19 that continues to wreak havoc worldwide. While his priorities will be domestic, as I mentioned to you, the president-elect may prove more popular abroad than he is at home, partly because of his global experience. Indeed, between his first election to the Senate in 1972 and becoming vice president in 2009, Biden was twice chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, traveled extensively to conflict hotspots and disaster zones, and met with a large number of foreign leaders, some of whom are still in office. And yet, for all this experience, Biden has already backed controversial policies and made bad calls during his decades in foreign policy. For instance, as a senator, he opposed authorizing Operation Desert Storm to oust Saddam Hussein's Iraq from Kuwait, but then supported the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which turned into an epic failure that dragged on for years. While the first operation, Operation Desert Storm, was a campaign that succeeded with lightning efficiency. In 2006, he wrote a widely criticized op-ed in the Times that proposed the division of Iraq into autonomous Sunni, Shiite, and Kurdish statelets, the kind of territorial split that ISIS achieved by carving out a Sunni caliphate, as you remember, between 2014 and 2019. Biden is a man of integrity who is impossible not to like, the former CIA Robert Gates wrote in his memoir in 2014. And then he continued saying of Biden, he has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. For his part, President Trump didn't get everything wrong. He was right in calling out China for its trade practices. He was right in supplying fatal arms to Ukraine, unlike the Obama-Biden administration. He was right in striking an updated trade deal with Canada and Mexico, and in brokering normalization between Israel and several Arab states, among other accomplishments. But let's return to Biden. Although he has not announced his full foreign policy team, the 3 pillars on which he will base it are already well defined. First, but not necessarily in that order, bring back Western Europe. One of Biden's top foreign policy objectives will be to revive the eroding transatlantic alliance with Europe, which until Trump took office had provided the very foundation of US interest, but which was badly shaken by Trump's doctrine of America first. A pragmatic realist on most issues, Biden is almost a romantic about the transatlantic relationship. And Europe wants it that way, obviously, especially amid the strains of UK's impending exit from the European Union. Most of the 27 EU member states, with the probable exception of illiberal Hungary and Poland, are relieved about his Biden's election. After 4 years of Trump badgering, the very concept of the Western alliance has meaning again, in the sense that Biden's pledge to convene a summit for democracy in 2021 will be an unequivocal call for the centrality of protecting democracy in US foreign policy. The second pillar of Biden's worldview is pooling resources, particularly on shared threats. He is expected to work quickly to repair relations with NATO after 4 years of bashing by Trump, and will push to adopt and broaden the alliance's mission for 21st century challenges. Challenges that include a more assertive Russia, international terrorism, cyber and missile threats, and the shift in the global balance of power with the rise of China. And finally, the third pillar stems from Biden's belief in international treaties and institutions. Among his early acts, Biden is likely to return to the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement and to re-engage with the World Health Organization to shape a stronger global response to the pandemic. He also plans to extend the New START, which is the only remaining arms control treaty with Russia that limits the deployment of middle-range nuclear weapons, and which expires in February. Biden also wants to work with the three European powers, Britain, France, and Germany, as well as Russia and China, to strengthen the Iran nuclear deal that was originally negotiated, as you remember, in 2015 and abandoned by Trump 2 years ago. Last week, the Iranian President Rouhani said that Biden's election provided an opportunity for the United States to make up for past mistakes, but that we're going to see a little bit later. Let's now turn to, briefly anyway, how a Biden administration is likely to address some specific major challenges it will be facing. First and foremost, the China challenge. Biden's first move on China could be obviously dictated by Trump's final month. Indeed, there is a widespread concern in Washington that the current president, who's bitter at China for its role as the source of the coronavirus and its lack of candor in disclosing the gravity of the pandemic that he sees as a major contributor to his loss in the elections, might be tempted to make China pay, so to speak, by imposing further sanctions on Beijing in the last weeks of his administration. That would not be surprising considering the president's long-standing policy of placing tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of products from China, imposing sanctions on Chinese companies, restricting Chinese businesses from buying American technology, and in recent days, barring investment orders in Chinese firms with military ties, as punishment for China's unfair trade practices. While Biden has said little about the way he would deal with Beijing, he suggested, however, that the Trump's crackdowns may continue under his watch, albeit surrounded by more skillful diplomacy to bring European and other allies along. But even if the diplomatic niceties of the new administration might settle some long-running arguments over agricultural goods and the theft of intellectual property by Beijing, Biden will still face hard choices, such as deciding whether to maintain the Trump tariffs on about $360 billion worth of Chinese imports, and whether to relax those levies in exchange for concessions on economic issues or human rights that are of great concern, much greater concern to the new administration than the current one, with the detention camps in Xinjiang and in Tibet, with the arrest of dissidents in Hong Kong, and the ouster of foreign journalists who were the last bastion of independent reporting in China. In truth, even if Biden departs from Trump's punishing approach and his belligerent rhetoric, his administration will have to take into account the bipartisan pressure in the Congress to penalize Beijing for its human rights abuse, its global influence operations, and economic practices. But during this transition period, Beijing has not remained idle. Only last week, it signed the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, that includes the 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, plus Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. This new agreement, this new pact, is not very ambitious in scope, as it formalizes rather than remakes business between those countries, eliminating tariffs mainly on goods that already qualify for duty-free treatment under existing free trade agreements, while allowing countries to keep tariffs for imports in sectors they regard as especially important or sensitive, particularly in the sector of national security. And most conspicuously, this new pact does not include India, the other regional giant. India had called for a more comprehensive treaty before pulling out of the negotiations after its demands were turned down, particularly by China. However, the pact's symbolic significance is unquestionable. It covers 2.2 billion people and more than any other previous regional trade agreement, and further helped cement China's image as the dominant economic power in its neighborhood. It also comes after the retreat by the US in 2017 from the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP, which was a broader agreement than this one signed by these countries than the RCEP, in that it included major issues like trade in goods and services, intellectual property, and competition policy. At the time, you remember that candidate Trump had argued that such a treaty would undermine the US economy and its independence, and introduced instead an economic strategy of putting America first, consisting of what he called a fair bilateral trade deals that would bring jobs and industry back to the United States. Now, the question is, how will the new administration react to the signing of this latest pact between the Asian countries? Biden has not said anything about joining. Now, I have to explain to you that when the US withdrew from the TPP, the countries which were member states of that agreement decided that even though the US was no longer there, they should have a pact among themselves. So they created a new alliance, economic alliance, which was called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is, again, a new treaty. So Biden so far has not said whether the US would be joining this new partnership, which was, again, signed and ratified by the previous TPP member states. We'll see. Now, the second question is, how will the new administration deal with Russia? Well, you know very well, the past several US administrations have been tempted to try to get along with Russia. For instance, former President George W. Bush famously said that he looked into Putin's soul after their first meeting in 2001, and he saw someone who was extremely sincere and open. Well, when Bush, towards the end of his second term, tried to patch up relations with Putin, the Russian president invaded Georgia. Former President Obama tried a so-called reset with the then president, Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev. Then Putin invaded Ukraine in Obama's second term. President Trump tried personal diplomacy with Putin. And US-Russian relations, arguably, are at their lowest point in decades. Like in China's case, candidate Biden said little about the way his administration intends to deal with Russia, leaving one of his longtime foreign policy advisor, Jake Sullivan, to explain just before Election Day that the president-elect would be willing to impose, and I quote, substantial and lasting costs on perpetrators of the Russian interference, which could include financial sanctions, asset freezes, counter cyber attacks, and potentially the exposure of corruption by the leaders of the country. Now, that being said, as president, Biden will have to take into account Russia's arsenal that includes over 1,500 deployed nuclear weapons and a large number of tactical ones that Kremlin has been deploying freely, even before Trump exited the START agreement. So, how would the new administration end this downturn spiral? According to Antony Blinken, another serious advisor and likely candidate to the post of Secretary of State in the new administration. Biden would try to negotiate a 5-year extension of that deal, of the START deal, that again lapses only 16 days after his inauguration, and then seek to expand it to other types of weapons and other countries. And to get there, probably Biden would have to play on Putin's growing economic fragility. But that remains to be seen. That's another question mark, like China. The third specific issue is Iran, which is a resurgent crisis. As you know, Biden has promised to rejoin the nuclear deal with Iran, so long as Iran comes back into compliance with that deal. That vow, however, is easier said than done. First, President Trump, even as a lame duck, is moving quickly to increase American sanctions against Iran and to sell advanced weapons to Tehran's regional enemies. Policies that would be difficult for a new president to reverse. And second, Iran, where President Rouhani faces strong opposition from conservatives in elections set for next June, is expected to demand a high price to return to the deal, including the immediate lifting of the punishing sanctions imposed by the Trump administration and billions of dollars in compensation for them. What's more, Iran has today some leverage. When Trump took office, Iran had roughly 225, 230 pounds of enriched uranium, whose production was limited by the 2015 nuclear deal. After the American withdrawal from the deal in 2018, Iran declared it was no longer bound by the agreement itself and resumed enriching uranium at higher levels. Last week, the International Atomic Energy Agency, a UN agency, said that Iran now had some 5,300 pounds of enriched uranium, which is more than 8 times the limit set by the 2015 nuclear deal, making the breakout time is the time necessary for Iran to possibly build a nuclear weapon considerably shorter than 1 year. In that context, Biden is highly unlikely to meet the Iranian demands, considering also the strong congressional opposition to rejoining the nuclear deal as it is. Most experts agree that the parties should work toward an interim agreement in which Iran would roll back a meaningful part of its current nuclear buildup in exchange for partial sanctions relief, especially as regard to oil revenues. Can that work, or will that work? Nothing until January. We won't have a clear picture till January, and even then. Because again, first of all, we have to see what is happening with the Senate. And number two, even if the Senate has a Democratic majority, there is strong opposition in the Senate to rejoin the deal as it is today. The fourth issue is the Israeli-Palestinian one. in a gesture intended to get the new administration to reverse as many of President Trump's moves as possible. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank announced last Tuesday, you might have seen that it was resuming its cooperation with Israel, ending also 6 months of financial hardship for tens of thousands of West Bank residents. Well, as you know, the Palestinian leaders have ample reasons to resume cooperation with Israel. Their diplomatic positions have been badly compromised and shaken and weakened by the recent normalization between Israel and the Emirates and Bahrain, with many Gulf countries likely to follow. By the way, you might have seen that it seemed that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu flew to Saudi Arabia on Sunday for a meeting with the Crown Prince bin Salman, Mohammed bin Salman, of a couple of hours. And then he flew back to Israel the same night, which might announce some development in the Saudi-Israeli relations, which would be definitely a huge coup before the exit of the Trump administration, and which would weaken even further the Palestinian position there. Financially, the Palestinian Authority's decision, why it helps the Palestinians financially also is that you might have read in the press that to protest the American peace plan, which they consider to be leaning heavily in favor of Israel, the Palestinian Authority had taken the decision about 6 months ago not to accept the $100 million a month that Israel collects in taxes on behalf of the Palestinians and then redistribute to the Palestinians, to the Palestinian Authority. That has been done now for a number of years. So at that time, 6 months ago, the Palestinians and Mahmoud Abbas, who was the leader of the Palestinian Authority, decided not to accept that money to protest the peace plan. Well, he punished himself, actually. This decision has been counterproductive because the Israelis withheld the money. I mean, the Palestinians would not accept that money. They didn't get money from other sources either, because the Gulf countries, which are the major donors to the Palestinians, cut their support. And the European Union, which usually makes up for the difference with millions of dollars and tens of millions of dollars, euros every year, they told Abbas that first, in order for them to resume the assistance to the Palestinians, Abbas would have to accept, first of all, the money from the Israelis. So the election of Biden gave Abbas a pretext now to accept that money, and which obviously would help the Palestinians to pay for the salaries and the West to the residents in the West Bank. Because it got to the point where this refusal to accept money had depleted the Palestinian banks of their reserves to the point where to the point of endangering the Palestinian Authority himself capability to operate. Now, again, inviting a renewal of peace talks with Israel and resuming bilateral cooperation with Israel, particularly on security issues in the West Bank is Mahmoud Abbas's way of welcoming the new American administration. On the other hand, for Benjamin Netanyahu, things might be different. Almost overnight, Biden's victory downgraded somehow Israel's ranking on the list of US foreign policy priorities, diminished Netanyahu's stature on the global stage, although his yesterday's visit to Saudi Arabia might help him, and mostly undercut the argument to Israeli voters that he remains indispensable, their indispensable leader. What's more, Netanyahu's closeness to the Republican Party made him enemies of much of the Democratic establishment already during the Obama administration. When you remember, the most famous incident was when Netanyahu came to Washington to address a joint session of Congress at the invitation of the Republican Party to attack Obama's Iranian nuclear deal. A speech that Biden, at the time vice president, did not attend. And more recently, he faced the increased hostility of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party that considers the Netanyahu's government as an apartheid regime. In contrast to Trump's favoritism to Israel, reaffirmed actually during Secretary Pompeo's recent visit to Israel on Thursday, where he denounced the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement as anti-Semitic, and accepted that products made on the West Bank or exported from the West Bank, produced on the West Bank, be labeled made in Israel, which goes against many of the European Union member states, which demand that the products which are made in the West Bank be boycotted by the European Union because they are made and produced under Israeli occupation. Biden has promised a return to a more balanced approach that could mean gestures like reopening the American consulate in Jerusalem. Now you have the embassy that replaced the consulate. Reopening a Palestinian diplomatic mission in Washington, and restoring the US financial contribution to UNRWA, which is the United Nations Agency for Palestinian refugees in the West Bank. That being said, Biden is also enjoys many decades of a reputation as pro-Israel. At the height of tensions with the Obama administration, Biden was Israel's point of contact in the White House. And during the presidential campaign, he repeatedly stated that there will be no reversal of Trump's decision to move the United States Embassy back from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. And he loves to tell this story that when he was a child, his father told him, and that stayed with him over the years, somehow, that you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. And that stayed with him ever since. Now, let's move on to other specific issues that Biden might have to deal with in the near future. Confronting North Korea's nuclear threat is also one of them. Trump has described his friendship and 3 meetings with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as a success that averted war with a nuclear-armed, hermetically closed country. However, the president's approach has not only failed to persuade Kim to relinquish his arsenal, but bought him time to strengthen it. Last month, the North unveiled what appears to be its largest ever intercontinental ballistic missile. Now, whether that missile was just for show, nobody can answer the question. That could very well be also. Biden, who has been described by North Korea's official news agency, and I quote, as a rabid dog that must be beaten to death with a stick, has criticized Trump's approach as appeasement of a dictator and has said he would press for denuclearization and stand with South Korea, without indicating, however, once again, how he would specifically deal with North Korean belligerence. Then you have Afghanistan, where on that score, Biden's policy is not expected to be much different from Trump's. Biden too wants to wind down the US military presence there. And the recent announcement by the current administration of a reduction in the number of American troops in Afghanistan down to 2,500 by the end of the year is something that Biden clearly agrees with. Biden also continues to support intra-Afghan negotiations, but hasn't offered detail on how he would do that, partially because it is not clear what sort of situation he will inherit. By contrast, on Yemen, for instance, unlike the Trump administration, Biden will definitely support support and the end of the Saudi Arabia-led intervention that many lawmakers in the Congress on both sides of the aisle oppose, also because of reports of serious human rights violations. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, a return to international commitments. As President Biden is expected to reverse many of the isolationist and anti-immigrant steps taken during the Trump administration by disbanding immigration restrictions, stopping construction of the border wall with Mexico, expanding resources for immigrants. However, considering how many of Trump's policies enjoyed considerable support in the US and in the American public opinion, it remains to be seen how quickly, because these are not only foreign policy issues, these are also can be perceived as domestic policy issues. How quickly or effectively his administration can change that. So now, these are basically what I could glean for all this information that we've been getting in the past, since the elections actually, on what the new Biden administration might or might not do in the future. Again, these are campaign promises or post-campaign promises, so it remains to be seen. There are many elements at play, not only the Congress, but also different currents within the Democratic Party. The elections in Georgia for the Senate in January. So there are a number of elements there which are not clear yet. So we cannot have a definite answer to many of these questions. But this is how it is likely for the situation to evolve. Now, there were a couple of questions put to me, and then we open the floor for your questions. There are a couple of questions put to me last week. One of them, very interesting one, had to do with secularism in France. Now, and what the French policy in terms of secularism. I'll be very brief and I'll try to be very clear about it, because this is an issue which has been mentioned every time there are incidents in France concerning what is perceived in other countries as racism. There is, let me start by saying that there is a profound misunderstanding in the Anglo-Saxon public and media of what the term laïcité, which can be translated by secularism, means to the French. Well, it is basically the active separation of church and state, dating back to the early 20th century, when the state wrested control of the school system, of the school public system, from the Catholic Church. And this is a principle, laïcité, again, secularism, a principle to which the French are deeply attached. Ever since, laïcité has been the foundation of the French educational public system. Again, public system, because there are obviously religious schools in France where religion is taught and practiced. The subject has become increasingly controversial and polarizing over the past, I would say, quarter of a century. With the arrival of hundreds of thousands of Muslim migrants, who, unlike the previous waves of migrants to France, from Spain, from Italy, from Portugal, from Eastern Europe, these new migrants had a different religion, but also, and more importantly, could not assimilate so easily into the French secular society. Why? Because that religion, Islam, which rules every aspect of the daily life of the Muslims, clashed with the principle of secularism of the French institutions. And that's no surprise. Again, Islam teaches Muslims to submit to the precepts of the Quran, which again prevails in every aspect of their lives. Whereas the French have learned since the Age of Enlightenment, but mostly since the beginning of the 20th century with the new laws, particularly in schools, to free themselves from the influence of represented by the church. So naturally, the first frictions occurred in schools when Muslim parents requested special menus to accommodate religious restrictions in cafeterias. different schedules for sport activities for boys and girls, like using different times for swimming in a pool, separately for boys and for girls. And when Muslim students starting showing up in school wearing the veil, and so on. Another example is over the right of blaspheme, which is allowed by the French laws. Indeed, newspapers in France, and that's a tradition, regularly mock religion, every religion, in drawings and articles. Well, this is strictly prohibited in the Muslim religion, particularly when it comes to portray the Prophet Muhammad. So when a high school teacher was beheaded by an 18-year-old Muslim student for having shown cartoons of the Prophet in the classroom as a way to underline the importance of freedom of expression and of speech, President Macron responded with a crackdown on Muslim associations and organizations accused of extremism. He also made a vocal recommitment to secularism. Let's not forget also that more than 250 people have died in terror attacks in France since 2015, the most in any Western country. Now, as you know, in response, Muslim leaders around the world criticized Macron for his aggressive response, which they said focused on peaceful Muslim groups. But this is not what bothered the French president most. What angered him was the Anglo-Saxon interpretation of the incident, including the American newspapers and the New York Times in particular, that tended to blame France for not fighting systemic racism and accuse Macron of wanting to reform Islam. The French, but beyond that misunderstanding, again, some of the coverage Macron complains about does reflect a genuine difference of values. For instance, the French rolled their eyes at American demonstrative Christianity, while Macron's talk of headscarves and menus clashes with the American emphasis on religion tolerance and free expression, protected by the First Amendment. Actually, the French rolled their eyes at other things American too, such as the feminist movement that imposes, they consider to be particularly inflexible, and to impose and try to impose their views in every aspect of life, and the French call it cultural Maccartism, and the pervading Puritanism in the American society, and the national campaigns in the United States in favor of such and such cause, like smoking is one of them. So there is a misunderstanding. The French are saying they are not trying to reform Islam. They are just trying to privilege moderate Islam and not encourage Islam, which is taught by many imams in France to recruit terrorists and to encourage terrorist acts in France and in Europe. This is one issue that I try to just very barely and superficially just explain to you. And the second one is to answer your question, Tom. Not a question, actually, but you mentioned the other day the issue of fascism and populism versus populism. Just a couple of comments. to be sure, there are similarities between today's political landscape and what Europe experienced in the build-up of World War II, and Trumpism to some extent in the United States, as well as with other times when populism eventually turned into fascism, such as Franco's Spain or Perón's Argentina. But while fascism usually is rooted in populism, starting with populism doesn't inevitably mean they'll end up with fascism. First, let's say what they have in common, these two political doctrines. Division of society into two camps, like the people and the elites. The promotion of polarizing views. The demonization of the opponent. A contempt for judiciary, military, and political powers, and the strong intolerance of free press. But while America's democracy may have facing some trying times, there is still a key difference between populism and actual fascism, which is the use of violence. The adoption of violence to impose fascist authority is a key element of fascism, both as a movement and as a regime. It expresses itself as street violence first, and then through the militarization of government, and then through the militarization of government. Fascist leaders take power not just through popular support, but thanks to the action of squads that violently attack opponents. On the other hand, populism combines low-level actual violence and high-level rhetorical violence. In that is another important distinction between violence, between fascism and populism. Fascism is never a democracy, while populism undermines democracy but doesn't remove it. Another difference is that while fascism and populism both use democratic ideals to legitimize a non-democratic style of leadership, fascism is typically upfront about its outright rejection of democracy. For instance, when in Europe Mussolini rose to power and seized it, he openly spoke about his intention to crush the power of the parliament. Similarly, Hitler attempted a coup years before his party became the biggest in parliament. What's more, today, there is one major safeguard against fascism, which did not exist at that time, which is that most countries facing today populist wave have traditions and institutions of liberal pluralism that are much older and much more deeply established and rooted in society than they were in Italy in the 20s and in Germany in 1933. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I remember you comparing fascism and populism and saying that this country went through, I mean, you called the government, this government here, a fascist. And that's
what I was saying was that populism is fascism light. It's the stepping stone to that. And if you think that there aren't tens of millions of people in this country who would gladly overthrow our system of government, I was speaking to one yesterday.
Yes.
A friend of mine that I've had since third grade. And I haven't spoken to him in about 2 years. And I sat for 4 hours on the phone with him while he talked about the Jewish cabal, the Rothschilds, and the Bezos trying to take over this country, how we have to arm ourselves. It's just crazy. There's,
well,
Tom, there's a lot of that going around. And many of my friends that I've known my entire life are talking in ways that are so fanatical that And then the rise of militias. You talk about the use of violence in this country. I mean, many of these militias. I mean, they were planning to kidnap the governor of Michigan and try her and assassinate her. And Trump was sitting there saying, "Hey, that sounds like a pretty good idea," and such. We're
Well,
on
Tom,
the precipice.
to be also fair, there was violence on both sides. Okay, not only coming from one side, and it was not as organized a violence as it would have. You cannot compare Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany to Trump's United States.
No, but
There might be. Sorry?
my fear is that we're moving in that direction. It's going to take more time because, as you pointed out, we have democratic
There are
history in this
democratic
country.
institutions which are very strong in this country that you didn't have. Germany was still, reeling from the Great Depression and from
The loss of World War
the,
I.
the loss of World War II. They wanted their revenge, and Italy was Italy. So it's very difficult to compare it to the United States, even though I will agree with you if you say that there was a decline in the democratic, but that again, it was emphasized by the elections. Now that the elections are over, I do not believe that this the populist ideas will stay on. I don't think they will disappear with Trump's loss of the elections, because there are a number of people who believe, 73 million or 72, I don't know, who believed in it, but that doesn't mean they believe in violence and that they believe that the government should be overthrown by force. So I'm a little bit less. I'm more optimistic than you are as to the future of this country. Well, we'll see.
Our next conversation may be behind barbed wire.
Sorry?
Our next conversation may be behind barbed wire.
Do you know of any place being built in Montclair here, around here?
I don't know. Up here, I have a more conservative place. I live up here at West Caldwell, and they're building a re-education center.
Oh, and that's for us?
Yes. So we better watch out.
I could have, listen, it has one advantage. I could have more lessons than every 2 weeks and every 3 weeks.
You could give us a lesson every morning.
We could have a class or all of us, we could have a class every week, every Monday.
Right after our morning beating, right?
All right. So listen, it's been a little longer than usual. I don't know if Reiki is online. I just wanted to mention, she mentioned to me last week, the Danish farms of minks. I don't know if you remember, and the COVID-19, which affected them. I just wanted to tell her that I saw in the press that France, which has 2 or 3 farms of minks there, just slaughtered about 1,000 of them in one farm past week, because they turned out to 1 or 2 had the virus. And what made it more complicated, this is a strain of virus which is different from COVID-19. So the authorities are afraid that that strain would mute, and then you have to start working on a new vaccine. So they were destroyed in France also, and all over Europe, actually, Western Europe. I saw that Italy and Spain also, that have mink farms, destroyed their minks. So, ladies, you have fewer fur coats in the next couple of years to come. You have to deal only with wool and but no furs. All right, so let's move on to the okay. I see here I have a few questions already. from Alan. How many bilateral trade agreements with Asian countries has Trump administration negotiated? Well, none. Since it withdrew from the TPP and has not joined this new, as I mentioned, Alan, this new agreement that was signed among the former members of TTP. And it remains to be seen whether Biden will agree to sign this agreement or not. I also have to tell you, Alan, I don't know what this new agreement, that was just signed recently, and I don't know what it contains. So I cannot comment on it, if it's comprehensive or if it's very narrow. So we'll see as we go along. But again, this is
a question.
Yes.
Then, if Trump had proposed that he'd replace these multilateral trade agreements with bilateral agreements and does nothing of the kind in 4 years, how successful is that? I mean, it's supposed to be a substitute for the multilateral agreement.
Yeah, I know for a fact that the Trump administration was successful in signing bilateral trade agreements with Japan and South Korea. Okay, so those countries have bilateral agreements with the United States. For the rest of them in the region, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. These two countries already signed trade agreements with the US. I don't know how they can be brought into a more comprehensive agreement. I don't know. It's still too early to speculate. We'll see. From Richard and Beth. Biden announced Blinken as his nominee for Secretary of State. Comment. I have no comments. I don't know. I mean, my only comment so far is that from what I could see, and I'm not talking about Blinken only, but from what I could see, it seems to me that Biden favors the nomination of most of the people who were named, not by himself, but whose names are circulating in as likely holders of high-ranking positions in the new administration, seem to come, all of them, or most of them, from the Obama administration. So these are old hands, so to speak, who worked already with Obama and with whom, obviously, Biden will feel very comfortable since he was vice president. Thus, the few comments from the left wing of the Democratic Party, which doesn't seem to, the comments do not seem to be pleased with some of these nominations. But again, there was no official nomination, so there is no way of knowing exactly what has been, whom Biden has picked so far. But again, that being said, it seems like most of the people who have been selected for posts in his administrations come from the previous administration, from the Obama administration from 4 years ago. From Alan, in last session, we discussed the distinction between fascism and autocracy. Trump seems to be trying to move towards autocracy and away from democracy. Well, Alan, we can get into this discussion also, but it's a moot point now, so might as well forget it. Yes, absolutely, he was moving toward autocracy. But again, this is a moot point now. From Jeanette de Palma, I do not think so. Not true, I'm from West Caldwell. So Tom, be reassured. you won't be locked up anytime soon.
Watch out, Jeanette, they're coming to get you.
From Tom, appeasing dictators, that's Trump preferred modus operandi. Erdogan, Putin, Duterte, Bin Salam, Kim, why do we need the likes of Merkel, Macron, Trudeau when we have friends like this? I don't know. He likes them better. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe I have absolutely. We have to ask him, and probably in his memoirs it will be mentioned. One day.
Another thing, Pierre, you had asked me, like I think 2 weeks ago, or 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had told you about the quote that Trump made in favor of the camps that the Chinese were putting together for the Uyghurs, the Chinese Muslims.
Yes.
And that was from John Bolton's book. John Bolton was in the room when they were discussing this, and Trump agreed with the idea of the camps and was quoted as saying, "That sounds like a really good idea." So we have made such a quantum shift in terms of human rights around the globe that it's amazing.
Once again, Tom, he's going, or he's gone, Trump.
Not if he flips the electors.
Let's be fair to him just for a second and say that this human rights issue is a yo-yo in politics. It's used whenever it's convenient, including for the United States government, which looks away when, so-called ally countries practice human rights or perpetrate human rights violations. And they look the other way because of financial, economic interests. So, it's not only the Trump administration. Trump administration has been absolutely, I don't know who's unmuted. Lily De La Torre, I think, unmuted herself. If you could just mute yourself, because you speak over me. It's okay.
We've been intense hypocrites, as you know, in many cases over the years. But there's that old saying, you walk the walk or you talk the talk. We may not have always walked the walk, but we did kind of talk the talk when it came to, human rights. But now in the last 4 years, we just don't care. And I'll tell you something, when people look back at this administration, what they're going to remember is Mexican and Guatemalan kids sitting in cages at the border. That's going to be the thing. It's going to be the visual that people are going to remember. And it's things that I've never seen this country do before. And it's a shock to the system to see something like that.
Yes, but yet you had 72 million people who voted for him. So I don't know if he will be remembered only by the cages. But again, we'll see what the future holds. From Mark, be careful what you say here. Trump might be listening and taking notes. No, it was actually, Mark, who said that. It was when what's her name? Haley, when she was appointed U.S. ambassador to the former governor of North Carolina, when she was appointed to the United Nations as U.S. envoy to the ambassador to the United Nations, she came the first day or the second day. Obviously, she was paying a visit of courtesy to the Secretary General, and then she stopped in the lobby of the UN and surrounded with journalists. She answered a few questions, and the first thing she said was, "Well, the days where countries voted against us in the Security Council or in general are over. And from now on, we're going to take names." She said it, and I'm quoting her, which was amazing to everybody in the hallway. We're going to take names and we remember who voted against us either in the General Assembly or in the Council for Human Rights or in the Security Council. And then we'll know what to do, which is an amazing entrance in the diplomatic world. We're going to take names from now on. But someone said it before you. So it's not impossible that they might take names. Claire, even though the class is global events, can you let us know what are the main domestic issues that President Biden will focus on the first? Claire, you want to get me into trouble. Will a possible Democratic-dominated Senate prevent much to be accomplished? Well, these are innocent questions, obviously. Well, from his statement, Biden's statements, that the main issue apparently is fighting the pandemic. And obviously, with it comes the economy. Those would be or should be, according to what he's been saying, his first priorities. And then everything else. I mean, repairing or trying to repair everything else that Trump has done, or undo everything else that Trump has did, or most of the things that Trump has done during his term. Some of them will be relatively easy because they are adopted by just by signing an official decree, so they can be deleted with a strike or the stroke of the pen. Some of them are more difficult to get rid of because they'll have to go through the Congress, and then again we go back to the Senate elections in January and see what's going to happen. Will a possible Democratic-dominated Senate prevent much to be accomplished? No, you mean a Republican-dominated Senate prevent much to be accomplished? In foreign policy, definitely. In the appointment of judges to the Supreme Court, as you very well have seen for the past couple of years, definitely. Yes, the answer is yes. A Republican majority Senate can once again either slow or prevent some of his decisions, or the executive decisions, to be implemented, definitely. Not to mention that the Democrats now have a much narrower margin of action in the House of Representatives as well, where they lost about 10 seats so far. And they will worry about the midterm election 2 years from now, where usually, traditionally, the party which is in power loses seats, which is only normal, because some of the people, the Republicans obviously will focus of what the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives did not or could not accomplish. And there are some moderate Democrats in the South who will clash with the left wing of the Democratic Party. So the Democrats have a number of issues also coming out of these elections. Even if they win, well, they won the House of Representatives, but once again, the margin is much slimmer than it was a month ago. So we'll see. From Schoenfield to everyone, how troubled should we be by the spineless silence by almost all Republicans? Don't be troubled. You have a couple of months to relax. I want you to just take it easy and not trouble. Well, how troubled should you be? I don't know what you expect the Republicans to do, to denounce Trump now that he lost the elections. They are not going to do it because, again, it's not only they realize that Trump ideas and decisions over the past few years got about half the electorate to vote for him. So some of his ideas are extremely popular in the public in the United States. So they're not going to renounce and denounce Trump, renounce his policies and denounce Trump at this time. It remains to be seen how things are going along and unfolding, but you cannot expect the Republicans to denounce Trump while the new president hasn't been even sworn in. So give it a little time. But in the meantime, don't be troubled. Enjoy the holidays. From Claire, Biden just announced US ambassador to the UN. Any information about viewpoints? I haven't seen that. I don't know who the US ambassador to the UN will be.
Linda Thompson Greenfield, I think. I'm trying to remember now. It just announced this morning.
Okay, I haven't.
You don't know that. Okay.
Who?
Linda Thompson Greenfield, I believe is the last name. It's a hyphenated name. Look it
no,
up.
I have no comment.
Don't know. Okay.
I don't know. I don't know who. It's a lady. It's a man. It's
yes, a lady, Linda.
A
yes.
lady. No, I have no idea. But obviously, again, these are the first steps. We'll find out more about it in the next month or so. Unfortunately, we won't be able to share. We won't see each other till the end of January, but we can follow me like you, the development there. From Alan, yes, 72 million Americans followers of Trump may not accept Biden's presidency. I don't think they might as legitimate, which Trump claims. Where are we then? Where is our democracy? I fear this is a real possibility. Well, they might not accept it, but I remind you 4 years ago, half of this country did not accept Trump's election to the presidency, which they considered illegitimate. And I also remember all this reaction in the street, you're not our president, you're not our president. And that goes away after a while. So I don't know what, nothing will happen. It will come down like after every election, except that this one was more polarized than the previous ones. But nothing is going to happen to the American system of governance. From Tom, what do you think of Trump blowing off the G20 meeting on the pandemic in favor of going out and playing golf? It's because of stunts like this that so many of us despise him, are baffled by his popularity. I don't know what to say.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
Tom, he was true to himself to the end. That's all I can say.
It's mind-boggling. I mean, all the countries got together for the Zoom meeting to discuss the pandemic, to discuss the idea of trying to come up with some sort of united front against it, and he just blows off the entire meeting and goes off to play golf.
He blows out the entire meetings because in his mind, again, don't make me a spokesperson for Trump, because I really end up somewhere in West Caldwell. But what I suspect is that in Trump's mind, the US will have the vaccine very soon, and they don't need the G20 to discuss any global or coordinated initiative, since the US will be having its own vaccine very soon, December or January or February or March. So what's the point in consulting with the G20?
Plus, it's transactional too.
That's the only thing I can think of.
No, it's like you've pointed out, it's transactional too. If he shows up for the meeting, he doesn't make any money. But if he goes to the golf course, runs up a bill on his golf course, and proceeds to hand it in to be paid, he makes some money on that. Transactional.
Yeah, but I don't know if he might not be as wealthy as he pretends to be, but I don't think he needs $100 or $500 or $10,000 or $100,000. So it's not a question of really money. It's just his belief that the United States does not need the rest of those countries, because acting unilaterally and individually, it is getting somewhere, because it's research and development in the medical field as well. It's the best in the world, Tom. And if you look, just out of curiosity, look this year at the names of the people who received Nobel Prize. Chemistry, physics, science, medicine. There is at least one American in each one of them. Not one of them has no American in it. So it goes to show something, that research in this country is still leading the world. So I believe that Trump's thinking is that the US does not need the rest of the world to discuss a global intervention against the pandemic. It will have the vaccine first, and it will be efficient, and the rest of the world will just buy the American vaccine, and that's it. So why consult with them when you can play golf?
You're honestly thinking that's okay? That's
I didn't
insane.
say, no, Tom, I didn't say it's okay or it's not okay. I think that if nothing else, out of solidarity, you could show up, even if you're condescending and you tell them, well, you should do, wait, and we're going to provide you with it. That being said, I don't say it's okay. I'm just saying that's Trump.
That's why we need to get rid of it. Because things like these are it's absurd. And that's why guys like Macron or Trudeau or even Boris Yeltsin and certainly Merkel, they're real leaders. What we have is a con man and a buffoon sitting in the White House.
Yes.
As for the golf, by the way,
he considers himself, to him, it's more important to be leader in the United States than leading the G20. But again, I don't want to get into a discussion with you about what Trump would do or would not do. I don't agree with that. Obviously, you have a G20 meeting, and generally speaking, the US president joined that meeting, since basically it's the US that created all these institutions, nobody else. But that's his way of thinking, I believe. Again, I don't know more about his way of thinking than you. But that's what I believe. From Don, thank you, Pierre, for a superb series of. Thank you very much, Don, for your nice, happy Thanksgiving to everyone, and to you too. From Barbara, Linda Thomas Greenfield was in the Obama administration. She was an Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. Thank you, Barbara. I didn't know that. From Janet Eloren, from Alan. Thank you, Pierre, again for a very interesting cycle. See you in January. See you in January, Alan. Happy New Year, happy Thanksgiving, and hopefully, well, not at the beginning of next year, but at some point in 2021, we'll be all able to see each other personally. Seanfield, do you think Trump or Ivanka will be convicted of violating tax or campaign financing law? You're taking me back to the to the minefield, to the domestic concerns. I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea if they're going to take him. They'll be convicted in. Once loses his political shield. I don't know. They might. I don't know. He might have. Probably he will have at some point to publish his tax returns also. But I don't know, really. From Richard and Bess, thank you for a most informative process. See you end of January. And you too, Richard and Bess, thank you for your kind words and happy Thanksgiving, happy New Year. From Larry, isn't the US company Breakthrough on the vaccine a joint venture with a German company? Does Germany have any rights? That's a very good question. It is. It is a joint venture with a very small German company. That German company actually made the discovery, apparently. That's what I read in the European press. It hasn't been emphasized in the United States, where only Pfizer has been mentioned. But actually, you're absolutely right, Larry. It's a small European startup actually that came up with a vaccine. This company is headed by a Turkish couple that came to Germany. I don't know how many years ago. They are both, one is a doctor, the other one is his wife, I think is a researcher. And they came up with this vaccine. But the financial support came from Pfizer. So that I have not seen much about this story in the American newspapers. The European newspapers, however, reported on that. Now, does Germany have any rights to the vaccine? Well, it's a German company. I don't know if Germany per se, as a state of Germany, you're asking me if they have any rights to the vaccine. Probably the agreement between Pfizer and this small German company, I forget its name. They must have signed an agreement, and Germany, probably the German company, must have some rights to it. But again, it remains to be seen how the vaccine develops and if it's efficient and all that. But definitely, the company must have some rights to it. From Josie, a terrific final session. Thank you, Pierre. See you at next trimester. Happy Thanksgiving, all. Happy Thanksgiving to you, Josie. And Happy New Year. From Tom, you're okay in my book, Pierre. I don't care what Trump says about you. All right. Well, listen, hopefully we won't finish up in West Caldwell in a camp. In the meantime, all the best to you. And
you as well.
keep safe till January and beyond. See you on the 25th of January, I presume. From Mark, there is a rumor that Melania wants to rent a room in the White House when the Bidens move in. Thanks you for a great class, Pierre. I would think, on the contrary, Mark, I think that Melania, from the way she behaved all this time, wanted to get out of the White House as soon as possible, not to rent a room there, whether the Bidens or not the Bidens, just to be away from Trump. But that's another story. That might still come in the near future. That might be the first, I don't know.
The divorce is coming now.
The first reaction to Trump's loss is that Trump moves down to Florida and Melania goes back to Slovenia. I don't know. I don't know. But she doesn't seem very happy to be stuck, not so much in the White House, but to be stuck with with her husband. Sherry, thank you for another interesting, informative. Happy holiday to you and everyone. Looking forward to the start of the new session in January. Thank you very much, Sherry, and see you then. This is, I guess, the last message. See you all in January. Happy Thanksgiving, happy Christmas, happy holidays, happy New Year. Norma, thank you very much. Really enjoy this. Sue, take care. See you in January. You too, Sue. All the best to all of you. And see you indeed in January. Michelle, if you're still around.
Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you to you all. Michelle, if you're still around, well, I'll send you an email. Probably you're not around anymore. You got sick and tired of for these seven classes. So it's understandable. I'm not holding against you, Michelle. I'll be sending you an email. Thank you again, all of you. Barbara, bonne année, joyeux Thanksgiving, et à très bientôt alors. Et pour les classes de... Je vous entends pas. Je vous... Unmute yourself.
Bonjour, je merci Donald.
Ah, voilà.
Ah oui,
Alors,
oui.
Have you served me about the minks?
Yes.
No, but I'm asking, Ricky, have you heard me about the minks? No? No. All right. Barbara, meilleurs vœux, bonne année.
Merci à vous aussi également.
Pas de chaos.
Oui. Moi, je veux bien, mais ça n'arrivera pas.
Mais non, mais les enfants grandissent aussi. Ils ne vont pas vous embêter très longtemps.
Oui, oui, oui.
Bien, bonne année à vous et puis on se voit en janvier donc.
Oui, en janvier, à pas tout le monde. Oui, au revoir.
Bye bye everybody.
Au revoir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pierre.
Thank you.
And thank you for the invite to see this class, to be part of this class.
You're welcome. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Au revoir.
Bye.
Merci.